like if I was advising, I'm not sure I would say do a major kingpin strike like 2 months before the World Cup or the qualifying matches of the World Cup because of the immediate fragmentation you can see immediately thereafter. You might want to wait, either do it earlier or do it immediately after or something like that if you have control over the timing. But if the view is they had him in a certain place at a certain time, then they said our window is closing and like we've got to do this now. So that may have been an issue.
Well, sometimes on this podcast, I get to learn about a lot of new things that I didn't know about before. It's so interesting to be able to speak to different experts who have insights in all kinds of things. I didn't know when I set out to do this that I was going to have a really in-depth conversation about the cartel and drug lords. America's Cup is focused very heavily on the US side of things, but the US has two co-hosts and all of these things are so intertwined. So it was time to venture down to Mexico as one of the host cities, Guadalajara, has had some issues with violence over the past few weeks. I came across this because I happened to be in Canada in February when news reports were that any tourists in Puerto Vallarta in the state of Jalisco should stay where they are, and flights were being grounded after there was gunfire at Guadalajara airport. And Puerto Vallarta is a really big tourist destination for Canadians trying to get away from the winter cold. So that was big news up there. The kind of biggest, most wanted drug lord in Mexico, El Mencho, was captured by the Mexican government. He died and violence broke out. The violence was short-lived, just a couple of days, but it was pretty widespread and expansive across a lot of Mexico. There were roadblocks, there were hijackings of buses and trucks that were set on fire on highways, there was arson of businesses, but it was really concentrated in Guadalajara, which is the third biggest city in Mexico, and importantly, it is a World Cup host. It's going to host 4 matches, including a couple of big ones, Spain, Uruguay. Reportedly, South Korea and Colombia will also be staying in Guadalajara as their base camp. So I wanted to find out a little bit more about whether it was safe for fans to go down there, what the situation is now, what security looks like come the World Cup, and anything on the horizon that we can expect. And so I spoke to Nathan Jones, who is an associate professor of security studies at the College of Criminal Justice at Sam Houston State University, whose research is focused on organized crime, violence in Mexico, and drug trafficking and all that stuff. And so here is the interview. Nate, just tell me a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Okay, yeah. So I'm a department chair for the Department of Security Studies at Sam Houston State University, a role I just started. I'm also an associate professor there. I research Mexican organized crime. I did a year of field work on organized crime in Mexico for an academic year. I was studying primarily the Tijuana cartel, or the Cartel Ariano Felix, but also its allies and adversaries. And then I've become a little more risk averse, and I'll make occasional research trips, but primarily I'm visiting family. My wife is from northern Mexico, and also I do a lot of social network analysis. I got the SNA bug, so I use social network and analysis now a lot more to research Mexican organized crime. The stuff that I've written, I think that a lot of people have started to pay attention to, especially with the decapitation strike on El Mencho, for example.
I mean, I got to ask, how were those years being on the ground there? I mean, you got to really take care of yourself, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was very cautious. And I've known other academics who were doing a little more aggressive research, directly interviewing traffickers and stuff like that. And it led to security issues for some of them. And for their privacy, I'm not going to go into any details, but I typically try to interview victims, law enforcement on both sides of the border, people who had been able to debrief cartel operators, listen in literally on their radio dispatch wiretaps, stuff like that. So that was primarily how I've gone about my research.
Well, do you mind breaking down kind of in a nutshell, who El Mencho was and what happened that triggered the violence that followed?
Okay. All right. Yeah. So El Mencho is probably one of the, if not the biggest leader in Mexican organized crime. Certainly after El Chapo went down and Mayo Zambada went down back in recently in 2024, El Mencho and his cartel, the CJNG, were widely viewed as the top dog in Mexico. Up until 2024, it was viewed as we could literally network map out. It was a bipolar structure between the Sinaloa cartel and the CJNG. Subsequent to that, one of the Chapitos turning himself in and kidnapping Mayo Zambada and taking him with him. Subsequent to that, the Sinaloa cartel went into kind of a civil war where they split in half. And the Chapitos allied with the CJNG, led by El Mencho. So who was El Mencho? El Mencho was a very shrewd, ruthless, very effective drug cartel leader. He was in San Francisco, I believe, in the 80s and 90s with his brother. There's a great article in Rolling Stone, Brutal Rise of El Mencho, kind of depicts this. And his brother did a drug deal that went bad, was with undercovers. And apparently El Mencho had distanced himself, realizing like, okay, there's something not right about these guys. And so he was very shrewd. And he probably could have gotten away with it, given the way that he was able to distance himself from it. Very casually kind of like backs away from the deal. But they offered his brother a plea that would only be accepted if he also pled. So he ends up getting a sentence, and then he ends up he was in prison in California. I believe he gets transferred to Texas. Then he goes back and becomes a police officer in the state of Jalisco. That's the job he got after a drug conviction in the United States. And then he was with the Millennial Cartel, and he was probably with the Millennial Cartel all along. And he marries a woman with the last name Valencia. That's the family from the Millennial Cartel. But at this point, the Millennial Cartel had been weakened in a battle with La Familia Michoacana and was kind of viewed as a subsidiary working under Nacho Coronel of the Sinaloa cartel out of Guadalajara. Nacho Coronel is a major trafficker. He's known as the King of Cristal. I believe one of his sons was killed by the Zetas, and so he formed a group called the Mata Zetas, or the Zeta Killers. And this is how we first started to hear about the CJNG. This is kind of its origins, but it was like Millennial Cartel going out, being very aggressive against the Zetas. We heard about them really 2010, but there's some reports going back to 2009 while Nacho Coronel might have still been alive. And then he gets killed by Mexican security forces. And then you've got the CJNG rise. And they had this just very rapid ascent. They spread like wildfire. So as the government was engaging in all these kingpin strikes against all these various cartels, there were these cells that became independent operators, and they started to fall under the banner of the CJNG as they spread.
And then, so in February, the Mexican government then was able to basically capture and kill El Mencho, right? And then what was the violence that followed in Guadalajara?
Okay, so what we found is that there are these automated responses to major kingpin strikes or when major players are taken. There's this automated response where the cartel operating under their control will essentially cause chaos. They'll do narco bloqueos, burning vehicles, things like that, to take control of or shut down critical choke points related to transportation, things like that. And we saw this very viscerally in 2019 in what's known as the Culiacanazo. So the Culiacanazo was 2019, Ovidio Guzman, the son of Chapo Guzman, was captured in Culiacan. And the Chapitos organization essentially laid an urban siege in which they could shut down the city, cause so much violence, so much chaos, so much damage that the president of Mexico himself said, okay, release him. It's not worth it at this point. There's too much damage being done. But the CJNG had been doing this before. In many ways, I think that Chapitos had copied this from the CJNG and other cartels like the Zetas who had done similar things, setting up those choke points or roadblocks so that their leadership could escape and things like that. So I think that this was like an evolution where they were seeing each other do these different things. The other thing is, like, after the Kingpin strikes, you had individuals or cells that got adopted by other cartels. So you saw this overall homogenization. We used to talk about them all being very distinct. I don't think you can do that as much anymore. I mean, I do think there's some of that, but in many ways they're adopting each other's tactics, techniques, and procedures. So the Chapitos did this. That was like the big example. But like back in 2012, 2013, there had been an incident where they'd done this and Mencho had been able to escape. And so it's this automated response that just happens. It's not like a strategic decision is necessarily being made. The strategic decision was to turn this into an automatic response. So that kind of violence that we saw across multiple states was essentially a way to communicate to the government, to communicate to the population, hey, look how much we're going to make this cost you every time you do this, to try to deter this kind of activity. So I think that there are multiple audiences that it's playing to, and I think that that's important to bear in mind.
How much does that violence, automated violence you talk about, how much does that affect the general public? Is it pretty insulated among gangs, or is this coming into public life? I mean, I saw footage from Guadalajara airport where there was gunfire and stuff like that.
Well, it definitely comes into public life. I mean, certainly the public is seeing these high levels of violence. You saw the resorts in Puerto Vallarta
Yeah.
had you throughout the city, you saw plumes of smoke coming. It really is a way to generate the spectacle of violence. Also, without necessarily killing a lot of people, right? So, like when they're setting a bus on fire, they're not leaving the people inside. Typically, they're clearing them out.
Okay.
Because as any terrorist group knows, those civilian casualties are a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it sends a big message and it gets a lot of attention. On the other hand, it also gets you the wrong kind of attention. So there is this like battle being played for legitimacy, killing a lot of innocent people. Innocent people do get killed, but killing a lot of innocent people in like mass casualty events, that ends up turning the population and the state against you in a stronger fashion.
How's the situation at the moment?
What we saw was this very high spike in violence, and it was across multiple states. Initial reporting was 5, but it was like a lot more than that. There was violence all over the country. And then it stayed for a few days, but the tempo immediately dropped down after day 1. So it does make you wonder about the logic of it. Is it about getting the person back in the chaos of and the fog of war that they think on day 1 they can still get the person back? And then once they're absolutely certain, okay, we're not getting the person back, we're going to keep this up just for a little bit of deterrence, but we're not going to expend as much energy. The other thing is if you expend a lot of energy and try to keep the tempo of that kind of stuff up, you're not making money. And the government is likely to have a stronger state reaction to you, which is kind of the title of my book from 2016, Mexico's Illicit Drug Networks and the State Reaction, how the state responds.
To pivot then to my interest area, which is the upcoming World Cup. And, Mexico is due to host in 3 different venues, including Guadalajara, right? So they have
Yeah,
some
yeah.
high profile matches coming, I think Spain, Uruguay, and they're
hmm
hosting, I think a few teams, Colombia, South Korea, are going to be based in Guadalajara. It's speculation, I suppose, but how safe is it, to ask the broad question?
What I think that the Mexican government is going to do is a saturation strategy in those areas. So they're going to want to send the message that they can secure those venues. Now, in a worst case scenario, they might do some change of venues. I would imagine that they would pivot to, say, Mexico City or Monterrey, where they've got other venues going. But I think that the most likely scenario, and this is, again, speculation and analysis on my part, is that the Mexican government is going to view this as a potential embarrassment if they don't do a saturation strategy where they have lots of National Guard. They're probably going to bring in lots of local police, but also lots of National Guard, which is a gendarmerie force. Kind of the idea of the National Guard was they had to solve the militarization problem, which was they were using the military for too much. So they created a law enforcement apparatus that had military capabilities. That's the National Guard force, but it really is kind of just direct lines of control through the military. So it's really just military force, but now with better legal justification in terms of law enforcement. So my assessment would be that they're going to do a saturation strategy, put a high number of National Guard forces there. The question for that will be less will they be able to like secure those areas and more what about the other areas that they have to pull troops away from or law enforcement away from and what's going to happen in those other areas. So I definitely think it's going to be a matter of national pride for the Mexican government. They're going to want to secure all of that. Mexico City has the highest per capita number of law enforcement, like it's like an abnormal high per capita count. So even if they're just doing preventive policing and not like great investigative work, there's just a lot of just cops on the street deterring things. So I think that there's going to be a lot of effort to kind of just control and send a big message in that sense. And I think that there's also going to be an incentive for cartels to keep it cool because that will engender a stronger state response against them if they do that.
Why is there an incentive for the cartel to keep things cool?
If we're talking about the Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación specifically, they've just had a decapitation strike against a major symbolic and likely also operational leader. I mean, he was very careful to stay away from phones, but he was still on some level an operational leader, probably also start giving, strategic command. I don't think somebody like El Mencho would just be completely divorced from any operations. I think he was just incredibly cautious about avoiding being near a phone because of U.S. signal intelligence and that he was just a very high value target. One of the advantages if you think about it, he was the head of this cartel for at least 16 years. That's a lot of stability for this organization. They're going to be immediately naming a successor and trying to establish control over the succession mechanism and establish that they continue to have control. Because if they don't do that, then there's going to be a lot of groups that are going to fragment. We have to remember How did they grow from the first place? They picked up a lot of orphan cells, and the way these cartels work is there are usually plaza bosses who control cities and the movement through those cities. And at any time, any one of those guys could either say, I'm independent, or say, I'm joining it with another group. I'd love to be a fly on the wall of those emissary conversations about how they flip, because we know that they do flip. They side switch a lot more. We used to think that they didn't, and increasingly we know that they do a lot more than we think, especially in these epics of decapitation. So bearing that all in mind, wanting to maintain their logistical supply lines and things like that, I think that they're going to want to minimize some direct confrontation, especially with the federal government. It's also important to remember, wherever the Mexican government saturates an area, they're going to beat out the cartels. This fantasy that these cartels are like these super sophisticated military apparatuses that can take on the Mexican government is largely fantasy. They do have some sophisticated capabilities, but wherever the government is going to concentrate resources, they can get them to melt away, run away, and provide some level of security. The question is, can the government be everywhere at once? And it turns into a game of whack-a-mole. And that's a classic problem of insurgency, counterinsurgency.
The other two host cities that we mentioned, Monterrey and Mexico City, I mean, do they seem to be relatively safe? And if, like you said, if you're saturating Guadalajara, are those being exposed, or are they not really part of the issue?
I would imagine, not that there are not problems in Monterrey, but it's not the concern that Guadalajara is, given what has just happened. So Monterrey has gone through a period where they've improved state and security forces. There are certainly pockets of Monterrey, like there are neighborhoods that are known to be kind of criminally controlled, and you stay out of those. Also, Monterrey is really interesting. There's the suburb San Pedro. And San Pedro is known as being like one of the wealthiest suburbs in all of Mexico. Tec de Monterrey is like the Harvard of Latin America. It's widely considered one of the best universities. And so my view would be the Mexican government is going to be doing a lot of saturation of those three cities. Mexico City will be the easiest because they have tons of local law enforcement that they can also draw on, but they'll also have National Guard there as well, I would think. My assessment would be that there's a lot of incentives for everyone to take all the security precautions that they can to make sure that these things go off without violence.
Yeah, I'm trying to get a sense of why this is happening now. Is any of it part of a cleanup for the World Cup? And also, how much of an effect has Trump been on Mexico doing what it's doing now?
Well, I think the Trump administration and their policy has put a lot of pressure on Mexico, in particular, linking tariffs to some of the security issues. So there's been a lot of pressure. The question is, are these responses more symbolic responses to say, hey, look, we're doing stuff? So, for example, there's been 3 waves of dozens of extraditions each of major narcos who were being held in Mexican prisons. And they get extradited to the United States, but they're not really extraditions. These were like military expulsions under a national security law. Now, I do think death penalty might be off the table. That might have been an agreement, because that's typical for a Mexican extradition, because they don't have the death penalty. So there's like an agreement there. So there's been these 3 big symbolic things. And then you've got the takedown of El Mencho right before the World Cup. If I was advising, I'm not sure I would say do a major kingpin strike like 2 months before the World Cup or the qualifying matches of the World Cup, because of the immediate fragmentation you can see immediately thereafter. You might want to wait, either do it earlier or do it immediately after or something like that, if you have control over the timing. But if the view is they had him in a certain place at a certain time, then they said our window is closing and like we've got to do this now. So that may have been an issue. So I don't know if that was pressure right before World Cup, but any analyst would tell you major kingpin strikes can lead to fragmentation in the aftermath.
Okay.
The only question is, was the assessment made that a successor would take over and be able to stabilize things and be easier to negotiate with? In that sense, it's almost like remove Maduro, can we negotiate with Delcy and Venezuela better, kind of a thing.
For fans that are still traveling to Guadalajara, when we talk about this saturation of security, I mean, what is that going to look like? Sometimes security can feel more jarring than the threat itself, right? Like it can feel very militaristic. Is that something that they should look out for?
I would expect that there would be significant security personnel walking around likely with heavy weapons. I mean, not like heavy in the sense of like a javelin missile, but like I would expect that the soldiers walking around would be prepared to repel a firefight if they had to. And to expect that if you were a fan, you would probably are going to see a significant number of both private security, local law enforcement, and federal, both Army and National Guard forces.
And
Yeah.
is there anything that fans can do to stay on the safe side as they're kind
Well,
of roaming around and enjoying the city?
yes. Oh, certainly. Stay out of trouble. Like, have a good time, but don't engage in any illegal activity. Don't purchase drugs. Don't get so drunk you've got a problem. Take standard security precautions. Follow all, for example, U.S. State Department has really good warnings. And Mexico is the only country for which the U.S. State Department does state-by-state travel warnings. And that is because they understand the importance of the tourist industry for Mexico. And certain areas can be fairly safe, assuming you're not, causing problems or anything like that, or you don't have any characteristics about yourself that are problematic. It's going to be acknowledged that there's going to be a lot of foreign people there, not from Mexico during that period. So there's going to be an awareness of that. Yeah. So follow all government warnings, including your own government warnings. Stay in the areas that you know are safe. Mexico is beautiful. There's beautiful colonial churches, cathedrals. Guadalajara is a beautiful city. I've been there myself. But yeah, people should take kind of standard security precautions and enjoy themselves. I'm really excited about the World Cup. I just wish the tickets were a little more affordable.
My God, yeah, that's a whole other story. It's
That's
really
that's a
insane.
different conversation. It's funny. I have some of my students who are working like doing high level security planning for the World Cup, and because some of it's going to be hosted here in the Houston
Yeah.
area. And I was like, "Can you get me tickets?" They're like, "I can't get myself tickets, man. Like, I can't get myself tickets to this one." Yeah.
It's really sad because it locks out, some of the really passionate fans, right?
Yeah. And that is a bummer. And then I was getting a question in, I think it was like France 24 interview, and they were asking me about like potential hooliganism. And I was like, well, given the nature of this ticket situation, like now that I think about it, the people who are engaging in those kinds of activities have probably been aced out, which on the one hand, your true fans are getting aced out,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, you're probably getting a different kind of fan, so you're probably going to have less of that. One thing, Mexican law enforcement and military they have their own kind of issues in Clasico matches. Like, just one little side story. I
Yeah.
went one time to a classic match. It was like a rivalry. I think it was like Pumas America. And I remember there was no problem. And I remember kind of looking over and seeing like a wall of police just standing there watching the game, and they were in between the two sides, right? And I thought to myself, my lord, there's like a cop for every single. I was like, will the cops outnumber any
Yeah.
potential hooligan?
Well, sometimes they have those
um
big shields as well, don't they, that they hold up?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. They're pretty. They've dealt with it before. Now there have been some notable, like, and I haven't gone and done an extensive study, but there have been some notable incidents where you've had some kind of problematic situations. But in general, what I've heard is that the training is rather good for how they deal with some of those things. So
Yeah.
hopefully they've got their highest level strategic planning for this. They're going to have no shortage of manpower for those types of issues. They'll be able to keep it safe and keep everything fun and for the love of the game.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
I got a question for you, Messi or
Yeah.
Ronaldo?
I'm a Man United guy, so I'm always going to say Ronaldo.
Okay.
Even though I think these days he needs to throw in the towel. And
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
I think
Okay.
he's a little bit too old now, and
Yeah,
he
yeah.
hasn't faced reality.
That according to my sons who are 10 and 12 and love soccer, that is the question, and there is a right answer, and it's Ronaldo. So
Yeah, we're on the same page then.